Years ago, I pitched in with my brothers Matt and Danny for a rundown cabin we chanced into on a piece of land a 20-minute float plane ride from the town of Ketchikan. We bought it sight unseen, each of us paying about what you'd pay for a decent used car. At the time, the three of us were unmarried. I had no immediate plans to have children, and certainly no long-term strategy about how I'd raise them if I did. All I wanted was a good place for fishing with my brothers that was out in the middle of nowhere, and my brothers felt the same way. We wanted a place that we could call our own, where we could trade our time in exchange for knowledge of the natural world. My life had always been based on the value of that transaction. Ever since I was a kid growing up in rural Michigan, I had taken strength and inspiration from my interactions with nature. The lessons I learned there had guided me toward success as a family member, a student, and a professional. I knew that going deeper toward nature would only bring more rewards. The fact that the cabin was home to a population of mice and a lone female mink only made it more appealing. At least these animals weren't coated in either mold or rust, which is more than you could say for any man-made objects inside the cabin. My wife, Katie, would later observe that it wasn't really fair to describe the structure as a cabin at all. That was overselling it, she said. Gradually, it became known as the Fish Shack. The main question we get from friends who visit the Fish Shack is, how did you guys find out about this place? My brother Danny has been a professional ecologist in Alaska for about 20 years. He's based out of Anchorage. In a broad sense, as an ecologist, he studies the relationship of organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. In particular, he focuses on salmon. Salmon are an anadromous fish, meaning that they live in the sea but migrate into rivers to spawn. While many people might regard salmon as a saltwater species because that's where they spend the bulk of their lives, Danny argues that it's better to think of them as a freshwater fish. Their lives begin in freshwater, and since they die after spawning, their lives end in freshwater. Danny's work with salmon is focused on their freshwater habitats. He studies the gravelly stream bottoms where they lay their eggs. He studies the little streamside brush piles and overhanging vegetation where the juvenile salmon go to find food and avoid predation as they migrate toward the sea. And he studies what happens when all those dead salmon carcasses rot away on the banks of the rivers or in the bellies of bears and eagles, and enrich the surrounding environments with the ocean-based nutrients that were transported inland inside of their bodies as fat, bone, muscle, and gut. It was this type of research that led Danny to the general location of the Fish Shack. He was working on a project gathering baseline biodiversity data about populations of freshwater aquatic invertebrates, insects, mollusks, crustaceans, along randomly selected salmon stream segments in southeast Alaska. In ecology, gathering baseline data is an operational term for taking measurements in an environment at a fixed moment. You're asking what lives here right now at this moment in time. You do this without making assumptions about how things used to look or what they're supposed to look like now. In doing that work, Danny became friends with a local man who's a member of the Tsimshian tribe. One day, a couple of years later, that friend called to let him know about an old shack that was up for sale nearby. We bought the place, then chartered a float plane so that we could fly out and have a look at what we now owned. At first, we discovered that we now owned a lot of garbage. Of the 2-acre parcel, about half was covered in decades' worth of refuse. Rusted out oil drums, rotted lumber, head-high piles of wet fiberglass insulation, jumbles of twisted logging cable, junked out outboard engines, paint and tar cans, irreparable boats, hundreds of yards of kinked polyethylene pipe, and all manner of other junk. The refuse was so overwhelming that you almost didn't notice the astounding specimens of old-growth hemlock and cedar that towered over the land and shack. The building itself was set on pilings, with half of the shack jutting out to the tide line. The structure was maybe 40 feet long and 12 feet deep. Not a straight line or right angle could be found on the place. It looked as wavy as the surrounding ocean. There was no electricity. Water was drawn from the creek and run through PVC pipes that were fastened to the inside walls with brackets and rusty screws. Heat came from a smoky stove powered by a drip line of fuel oil.